Rebecca.
Hi, so I'm Rebecca Strickland. I work with Charles in the Data Quality Hub based out of the ONS. Um, and I'm just going to be having a chat with our guests today and hopefully ask some of the questions that you might be wanting to know. So, the reason we've invited these speakers is because they've done some particularly interesting and relevant work in the field of data quality in those areas that we wanted to talk about. As Charles said, our first guest is Teresa. Teresa, I'm going to be talking to you today about building a data quality culture, which is one of the keystones of the framework. And I think one of the things that, from a kind of a data quality geek point of view, I recognize as being so important, but actually really so hard. Can you start by just telling us a little bit about where you come from and the work that you did?
Yeah, so afternoon, everybody. Thank you for that, Catherine, and thank you for inviting me to come and speak today. I mean, my background has been in data for, 20 years now, and but the last 12 years I've been working in law enforcement. So really looking to support forces in improving the quality of data they're holding locally and then sharing onto national systems. So a big part of what we've been doing really is about understanding how good or bad our data is, and that goes back to the point that Charles made on the previous slide around how we assess our data. And because we felt actually when we were starting that journey of building a data quality culture that we needed to be able to have the evidence to support what we were saying, so that when we were speaking to local forces and to chief officers, particularly if there was problems with their data and we were expecting them to resource and invest, then we needed to be able to evidence where we were coming from. So I think that would be the first point I'd make really around how we started that conversation was, well, okay, how good or bad is our data? I think secondly, we've done quite a lot of work really in understanding what data matters most to the people that we're working with. And that was quite important because, we are talking about frontline police officers who need data to support decision making that they do on the hoof, whether it be, decisions when they're out on the front line or whether they're back in an office. We wanted to make sure that the data that we were focusing on had the biggest impact on them. So a key part of that work was understanding exactly what the data was that mattered most. So I'm being distracted, Rebecca, by your
I'm
cat.
sorry. I shut my cats out before this meeting and they've broken in. So I'm
No,
sorry
that's
about the
okay.
cat distraction.
No, that's okay. Yeah, so I think that would be the second point to make was, what data matters most, because we are confined, aren't we, by resources and technology, and they are finite, aren't they? So we want to make sure that the efforts that we put in give us the biggest bang for our buck, if you like. So that would be the second point that we really focused on. And we did that in a couple of ways. I mean, obviously, a lot of it was conversations with police officers across all ranks and responsibilities, but also speaking to our communities about the way in which policing works in their area to understand what data we need to support the issues and concerns that they've got about policing in their local communities. So there's a combination of question sets there. The third thing that we looked at was, I suppose, a strategic understanding of data, I think would be the way I would describe it. So thinking about our chief officers in particular, making sure that they understand the value that data represents. So once we understand how good or bad it is, and we understand what data matters most, how do we get our chief officers to understand what value that brings? And that probably has been the toughest part of the conversation, really. Most chief officers don't join policing to do data quality, and I get that. But part of my role is to sort of inform them actually how much data matters to everything they do, whether it's ordering uniform, buying new technologies, identifying their most vulnerable, identifying the people in their communities that present the greatest risk. It all really is predicated on good data. So I think those are the three core things that I would point you to.
So if you I mean, how would you characterize the change from when you started doing this work? I mean, what does the culture look like now compared to when you started off? Really, it sounds like there's been a big shift. I'm just wondering what was that change look like?
We're not there yet. I think I probably should have said that at the beginning, really. This is still, I mean, it's a bit cheesy, isn't it, to say we're on a journey, but we are on a journey. I think the biggest change from, 5, 10 years ago is that technology drove everything. Previously, we were very, very interested in shiny things, new bits of kit, and we would invest in those without necessarily thinking about the data that sat on those platforms. So that's probably the biggest change. GDPR massively helped us with that, to be honest, because all of a sudden chief officers are going, oh, hang on a minute, I'm going to get an unlimited fine effectively. Where are my risks? And I think what we've realised in policing is an awful lot of our risk sits with the data and not necessarily with the technology. So I would say that was probably the biggest change. But we're not there yet. We've got 43 forces, 43 Home Office forces. I've got 43 chief constables and 43 police and crime commissioners to convince. So there's still some inconsistencies, but we're working towards it.
Sounds like an absolutely massive piece of work to be working with that kind of breadth of different people. And I guess, um, in terms of those people, what what have you found works in terms of influencing those people to kind of really make that change? Because I think probably all of us working in the data quality field are really aware that we're working often with people with vastly different past experience. Like you say, people didn't join this job to do data quality. So if you kind of had to have one tip for changing those minds or for influencing those people, what would it be?
I suppose for each force, I always go in there going and almost putting myself in their shoes really, and what's in it for me. I suppose it's a question that I think of asking myself about that particular force. So what's in it for me? And that will vary from force to force. But the key things that we found was risk. So an obvious one: risk of harm, risk of threat, money savings. We all know that there's a great guy from the 70s called Philip Crosby who talked about quality is free. And I love that phrase because actually it's the non-quality that costs you, doesn't it? The rectification costs, the service recovery costs. So I think money saving. The other big one for policing is reputation. No one wants to be on the Daily Mail headline around data breaches or data inaccurately recorded that leads to a particular outcome, whether it be somebody who's arrested inappropriately or whatever it might be, but no force chief constable wants to be in that position. And I think the other thing that works in policing's favour, and I don't like using this all the time, but it does help a little bit, is that we have there's quite a robust inspection regime that sits around policing. So the HMIC FRS, which is Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary's Fire and Rescue Service, we can work with them because they have the ability and the obligation to go into forces and inspect. So, if we've got concerns about particular forces and data, then there's the opportunity to work with them. So I think those it varies from force to force, to be honest, but that's probably a bit of a mix of what we would use.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. Um, that's been like it. The way that you talk about the kind of the change and bringing that back is really inspiring because having worked in organizations with that kind of broad um, challenges around data quality, I completely get where you're coming from with that journey. And I think that recognizing that this isn't a quick fix, oh, I turned the data quality culture on,